Good morning and welcome to this video on the basics of photography. Okay, so the goal is that in less than 10 minutes, you learn most of the basics of photography so that you can take photos that you love, and when you don't, you kind of know how to troubleshoot them yourself. When we start photography, it can be extremely confusing. There's a lot of things, so let's simplify that. And at the end of this video, I'll share with you a bonus technique that will make it even easier that I still use to this day to take good photos. But let's be honest, to become a master of photography, it will take you over 10,000 hours if you know the rules. But here's a good foundation for you to solve your initial frustration that we've all had. If you don't know me, my name is Pierre Lambert. I'm a travel photographer and the creator of the 30-day method to great photos, a step-by-step training to developing your photographer's eye. I publish adventures and tutorials on this channel, so feel free to subscribe to see the next one. Now, let's get started right away, because once you accept that technically photography is all about capturing light and everything revolves around that, what happens in your camera is gonna make a lot more sense. Your creative choices in photography will all affect how much light your camera gets. This is the eternal balance we're gonna try to find together. So the first thing that you need to know is aperture. Aperture refers to the size of the opening of the diaphragm inside your lens. You only simply need to understand that the smaller the f-stop, the number after the f, the more your background will be blurred and the more light your camera will have. For portraits with this creamy background that we call bokeh, when it's all blurry, you will therefore look for the smaller f-stop number. So our cameras work like our eyes. Darker it is, the more our pupils dilate to let light in. And just like your lens, the diaphragm will open more or less. And this is the number that is represented with the f over and the number, okay? So here's f over 1.2 up to f over 16. As you can see, f16 is tiny, f1.2 is super large. So the larger the aperture, the more light will come in. Okay, and also funny fact, the more it will cost you, because in photography it's a general rule of thumb, the more light you want, the more you have to pay. So you have to shoot everything at the widest aperture possible, you may be thinking, right? Well, no, it would be way too simple, because the aperture also impacts your depth of field, and this is your first creative choice. The depth of field means the area which will be sharp in the image, in focus. See what happens when I go from f1.2, we can barely see the background, to f16. We can really see everything in the background now, but f1.2, nothing. So if you want to take a portrait and separate your subject from the background, then yes, a wide aperture is awesome and I love to use it, but if you want to discern more things in your image, it will be up to you to choose a smaller aperture. For example, for a group photo, f4, for a landscape photo, maybe f5, 6, 8. When I do street photography and I want a lot of context in my images, I may shoot around f8. There's no need to go too high like f16, f22, because often you're gonna lose sharpness, and honestly you may also see dust on your lens and a bunch of things. So for now, just choose what you want to be sharp in the image. Do you want just the nose, or do you want the whole face? Do you want just a person, or do you want the background too? And once you've made that creative choice, we can go for the second one, which will be choosing if moving objects are frozen or if they're blurry in our image. And for that, we're gonna talk about the shutter speed. The shutter speed, the only thing you're gonna have to remember to succeed is that the higher your shutter speed, the more the subjects that are moving will be frozen. So here's an example of a long exposure. Everything that could be moving is blurry. And here's an example of a shorter exposure where the moving subject is sharp. Honestly, to put it simply, choose a shutter speed that depends on the speed of your subject. The faster it goes, the more the shutter speed will increase. So you may be asking yourself, why not make it as high as possible? Well, the issue is that the faster your shutter goes, the less light it's gonna receive. If you look at it in camera, it just goes up and down very fast, so it doesn't get exposed to the outside world as long as when you're doing long exposure. So to keep it simple, here are my rules in general, okay? It's gonna be 1/50 of a second for handheld, for static subjects or moving very slowly, 1/125th of a second for someone moving slowly, 1/250 of a second for someone walking a little faster, and even a bike, and 1/500, 1000, and more for anything that's like action, cars, birds, leopard, cat, something going fast. Those are the minimum shutter speeds I would use in order to freeze my subjects. Now, for night photos, well, with very little light, you actually want to expose your sensor for as long as possible. So you're gonna need to use shutter speeds like 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. And I strongly advise you to use a tripod in that case, because if you move with your camera, well, that's creating also motion, and then it will be blurry. I know that's a lot. Don't panic. We're almost there. What you need to decide here with the shutter speed is whether you want your subject to be frozen, sharp, or not. And there is no wrong answer. It's just your creative choice. And sometimes some blurry subjects moving can look really cool. Now, here's the big question. What should you do if your photos are too dark and if there isn't enough light? Well, luckily for us, for that, we just need to tell the camera to amplify whatever light it is getting. And that's when we start talking about the ISO, or ISO if you want to say it with a French accent. So what's the ISO? The ISO basically represents the gain of the sensor that's inside your camera that sees the light, that is sensitive to light. The higher this number, the brighter your image will, okay? It will amplify whatever the camera, it will boost it up and make it brighter, okay? So again, here we're thinking, why don't I put it as high as possible? Well, that would be way too easy. And remember, there's always a trade-off in life. There is no free lunch in a way. So the higher you increase your ISO, the more noise you will have in your image. Look at these examples. They're taking a different ISO, and you can clearly see that there is some noise in some and not in others. So the goal is going to keep your ISO as low as possible in order to minimize the noise while still having an image that's properly exposed, that's bright enough for you. Therefore, it is necessary to adjust that ISO depending on the light conditions, right? So outdoors in broad daylight, you can easily stay at ISO 100 in daytime, but honestly, the moment you come indoor or in the evening, I usually find myself cranking that up 800, 1600, 3200. Again, the goal is to maintain the creative choices I made earlier, meaning the depth of field and whether moving subject is sharp or not. And that was tweaking the aperture and the shutter speed. So one last thing, each camera will have different image quality at the same ISO, and usually the more you pay, the less noise you will have at high ISO with your camera. So noise at high ISO is mostly visible in low light condition, but you don't have to be afraid, because sometimes, honestly, it's better to have a bit of noise than a failed photo. It sounds obvious, but a lot of people are afraid actually to crank up their ISO, so don't be afraid, especially since nowadays you can reduce that afterward in post-processing. That's for another video, or even in your camera if you're shooting JPEG, there's like an automatic mode to do that. But let's just simplify things. Let's recap here. First, you need to decide on the depth of field with your aperture. The smaller the number, the shallower the depth of field and the more light you will have. Second, you need to choose your shutter speed. Do you want your moving subject to be frozen, sharp, or not? And third, you need to adjust the ISO to have an image bright enough while keeping those two creative choices. So I'll put a summary on the screen. You can screenshot it if you want, but I also have a free cheat sheet with settings that I use every day that you can find in the description. You can take it with you on the field, super helpful. But here's my bonus technique. If you want to forget all about that and make it simpler, put your camera in A or AV depending on which brand you have, and now you only have one creative choice to make, your depth of field with the aperture. The ISO and the shutter speed will be taken care of automatically by the camera. It's a mode that we call a semi-automatic, and most of the pros I know use it every day. I do, and this is a lifesaver. The other one is STV. If you want to only control the shutter speed, your second creative choice, you can go to that mode and let the camera choose the aperture and the ISO for you. Real time saver, and allows you to stay focused on one thing and be extremely swift on the field. So that was a lot. Here are the essential basics for photography. The key is to experiment, but don't forget there are all the camera settings that you want correctly to be set up for sharp photos. Watch this next video for that. Now get out there, go shoot, try something different, try something new. I will see you in the next one.